Ay, Corona! Apparently Corona's a Mexican beer. I haven't got any. What I've got is half a litre of apple cider with passion fruit and 9% alcohol of the volume. 3.2 of the standard drinks. Before we crack the top of the bottle, with all this rain, I've been surrounded by mosquitoes. So I actually invested in a new and fancy dancy mosquito coil burner. So I'll let it produce smoke, and in theory, all the mosquitoes will leave me alone while we contemplate the spectacle of novel coronavirus, coronaviral disease-19, as it spreads around the world. What do we know? What we know is novel coronavirus is an unusual virus in that it causes a kind of influenza, and whereas some influenza viruses are hard to transmit and they have a low death rate, others are hard to transmit and they have a high death rate. Because they're hard to transmit and they have a high death rate, they frighten people when the first patient dies, and then it turns out that not many other people are catching it. Corona 19, it seems to be not particularly too hard to catch through droplet infection being sneezed on, somebody wiping their nose and then touching a doorknob or a stair rail or stuff like that. The usual. Maybe sneezing into your eyeball. And it seems that originally they thought people who are infected are only going to infect 1.5 or so other people. Perhaps they're infecting 3 or 3.5 people. We don't really know. What we have discovered is that there's a symptom-free period of between 14 and 28 days after people have caught the coronavirus. And the really unusual thing is that people who've got no symptoms can have just as high a viral load being shed by their respiratory system. The mucous membranes putting virus into the snot as they blow it out into the environment every time they sneeze. Asymptomatic patients who look healthy, who test healthy to everything except a blood test, they can be pumping out more virus than somebody who's actually got a snivelly nose and feels like shit on a stick. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, I mentioned in a video that I'd seen the first coronavirus preppers in the town of Glen Innes. Young couple, shopping trolleys full of tins of beans, several layers of toilet paper on the top of their trolley, and they filled the back of their car with one pair of shopping trolleys and went back down in there to get more. And they had masks, not cheap masks either. They had fairly expensive high-grade masks, masks that looked like they were actually designed to try and exclude viruses rather than to prevent somebody from shedding viruses, because there's different kinds of masks do different things. Goggles, keep their little eyeballs safe, and they were shopping in disposable rubber gloves, which made it obvious that they were prepping. I don't recall ever seeing them before, and I haven't seen them again, so my guess is that they don't actually live local to the town of Glen Innes. They were cunning enough to shop in a different town to the one that they're trying to hide out near. So, last minute preppers, yes. Obvious preppers, yes. Ahead of the pack, though. Today in Sydney, supermarkets are running out of toilet paper. Yesterday they were running out of hand sanitizer. Been a bit of a run on baked beans. Been a bit of a run on pasta. Preservable, keepable food. All the sort of stuff that those of us who did a bit of prepping for the Y2K bug, we've been in the habit of keeping a fair bit of. In fact, some of us have probably got food stashes we put aside for the Y2K bug on the theory that if it's an actual apocalypse, if it's not actually mouldy, you'll probably eat it anyway and it'll be better than nothing. So yeah, there's been a fair bit of prepping going on, and there's the various kinds of mixed messages coming from the various people. The Chamber of Commerce and the Tourism Association are trying to tell everybody to just spend and keep going to the gatherings. And the International Olympic Committee keeps saying that, oh, we haven't cancelled the Japanese games yet. And if we do, it'll be cancelled rather than postponed. And the Japanese have said, oh, no, the contract says we're going to hold them in 2020. It doesn't say when in 2020. So yeah, the Japanese would like to think about postponing it. Number of cases in China are actually going down, which means that the Chinese vibrant emergency response 6 weeks ago, when they started building 1,000-bed hospitals, boing, pop one there and pop another one there and do them in 10 days each. Yeah, that worked well. That may be a trick that the rest of the world has to try and emulate. And here's why. I said that each person who catches the virus might be going to infect 1.5 to 3.5 other people. Yep. And because they're asymptomatic, you're not going to know that they're sick until after they've already infected probably 2 people. So it's entirely likely that 50 to 75% of the world's population will have contracted the virus in the next 12 months. That's why at the moment, a lot of places they're trying to do the isolation or the quarantine business. Now, quarantine is where somebody is suspected of having been in contact and they get isolated. Isolation is when somebody is known to have the sickness and you don't want them to circulate in the community and give it to anybody else. They're saying that the actual overall death rate from coronavirus is looking like 2%. Which doesn't sound like much until you remember that ordinary flu is 0.1%. So it's 20 times more deadly than the flu. It compares quite reasonably with Spanish flu in 1918, 1919, which had a death rate of 2% and only 50% of the population caught it. What I know about Spanish flu in 1919, like the handed down hillbilly family story, is that my father was 10 years old in 1919. Boats bringing returned soldiers came out back to Australia. It had taken probably 6 months for them to get from the end of World War One to soldiers coming back to Australia. So we're talking middle of 1919. During that time, the virus had mutated and become slightly less deadly by the time it got to Australia. But once it got into the Australian population, whoosh, half of the population caught it, and 2% of the people who caught it died. A lot of people got crook. Both my grandparents got crook, bedridden crook, couldn't get out of the bed. My father acquired a lifelong firewood fetish because at the age of 10, he was barefoot because they didn't run to school shoes. But he was going up and down the Park Creek, or Rocky Ponds Creek as it was called in those days in Glen Innes, picking up driftwood to bring back home so he could light the fire, so he could heat up the pot of soup which one of the neighbours had brought over as a donation because they knew that his parents were both too sick to get out of bed. He was nursing his parents at home at the age of 10 because the entire lawn surrounding the Glen Innes Hospital was covered in tents which were being used as wards because pretty much everybody got it all at the same time. And back then, well, Glen Innes had a functioning daily, or several times daily, train service. and the trains ran on coal, and we had coal mines, and transportation was fairly well guaranteed. There was no bitumen road to the coast, and there was no bitumen road to Sydney or Brisbane either, but the railway was there. So there was no actual hassle with supplies, and because there was none of this just in time delivery, if it took you a month or 3 months for a shop to right away and get what you wanted to buy, everybody was used to that, and it meant that most shops, they had at least a week to a month's worth of stock on their shelves. The bean counters and the accountants didn't like such a system, but it meant that there was a certain amount of resilience in the system. If somebody stopped supplying stuff from their factory, well, it didn't matter. Okay, the yuppies in the suburbs of Sydney have bought up the hand washing sanitizer solutions yesterday, and today they've bought up all the toilet paper. Two of the countries that are having the biggest problem with sort of exponential growth of the coronavirus seem to be South Korea and Iran. There's also cases in Singapore, and I don't know whether Singapore is copying China with the method of shutting down factories and telling civilians, do not come to work, isolate yourself, stay in your homes. If you need groceries, ring up and somebody wearing a hazmat suit will bring them to you in an Uber. All in order to affect what they call the R number, like how many times you're going to infect other people with this bloody virus. It's if you don't take any action to prevent people from talking to each other and breathing in each other's faces, the virus might have an R number of 6. You might infect 6 people for everyone who's got it. But if you lock everybody up in the houses, all of a sudden your R number might drop to 1.5. So that's kind of what China's done. And they've been pretty ruthless. I've seen videos of little robot-y looking fumigating machines negotiating the streets, squirting antiviral vapours. I've seen videos of people knocking on doors and going into the house and checking everybody's temperatures, and anybody who's sick, bundling them off to put them in an isolation ward. I've seen videos of people walking on the streets being approached by a drone that speaks to them and says, go away, go back home. You haven't got a mask on. Some people had masks and they were told to go home anyway. Some of the most alarming videos showed snatch squads where there were bunches of authoritarian fascist police driving around using an infrared camera to pick out which people in the crowd walking up and down the street had an elevated temperature, and then they were jumping out and going out, putting a net bag over people's head with a pole, like a 3 metre pole, stick that over their head, and that way they can't get closer than 3 metres, and their head's inside a netting bag anyway, and manoeuvre them off and stick them in a paddy wagon, take them off to the isolation ward. And China's daily number of diagnosed cases has been falling for about a week. China's daily death rate's been falling for a week. But it's out of control in Iran. It's out of control in South Korea. And, well, in Sydney, one doctor has got it, and he's had like 40 different contacts at least. And another nurse or an assistant in nursing at an old people's home she had 13 patients. She's got it, and she's in isolation. The doctor's in isolation. One of the nurse's patients, test results not back yet, but one of the nurse's patients has got a chest infection and is pretty sick. Another one of the nurse's patients has died of a chest infection. So the thing is, the doctor hadn't been outside the country. He got exposed by a patient who had been to Iran, came home from Iran, went to the doctors, didn't ring up the doctors, didn't notify anybody that they thought they might have the coronavirus, didn't wear a mask, just went and sat down and, waited for an appointment. So, congratulations. That was helpful. Sarcasm, irony, reversal of actual emphasis on the truth there. have to say that because some people think I'm being serious when I make an obvious mistake. But the nurse at the old people's home, nobody knows where she got it. Now, okay, that all, it means that we're headed for a situation where, now here's another point. 80% of the people who catch this bloody bug, they have a mild or a moderate case. If they've got a really mild case, they don't notice they've got it. If they have a moderate case, they notice they've got it and they're pretty sick. If they have a kind of a light heavy case, they can nurse that at home and everything's fine. But about 20% of the people who get it, they get such a hefty dose of it that they need to be hospitalised just for supportive care and treatment. And out of that 20%, 5 to 10%, they sort of need a trip to the intensive care. And the idea that 2% of the people who catch the virus die from the virus, it's made up of 5% of the people who catch the virus who need 3 weeks in an intensive care. And they need about a week on a respirator, or 2 weeks on a respirator, and a week getting over it. And out of that 5% or 4% who have to go into an intensive care bed and they have to be nursed very intensively, half of them are going to die anyway, right? You put 10 people into the intensive care ward and you nurse them all for 3 weeks and half of them are going to die because the virus is beyond them. So it's a funny phenomenon. ABC Radio National, quite often, if you wake up early and you get the 6 o'clock in the morning broadcast, you learn things that they don't tell you ever again. It's like the journalists get all enthusiastic. They make up their little news broadcast. They squirt it out there at 6 in the morning, and the censors get a hold of them and say, oh, you can't say that, it'll alarm people, you can't say that. So I heard one morning there about Wednesday last week, might have been Thursday, that nursing homes in Australia had been or were being notified that intensive care beds were being rationed. So basically, no more of this business of getting your 93-year-old who's got a chest infection and sending them to the intensive care ward and letting them die over 3 days at the hospital because their relatives want to be able to say, we did everything that we possibly could. No more. So nobody's going to get transferred from a nursing home to a hospital that has an intensive care ward. And the reason is an intensive care bed is going to set you back $10,000 per day per bed. And that was like 20 years ago when I was currently up to date on the figures. Probably, let's call it $20,000 for a bed. And if you're on a respirator, make it 30. It's expensive technology. It has a lot of precision, short life, consumable parts. And if you want to have a registered general nurse who's got all the qualifications, 3 shifts, 8 hours a day per patient, and you want to have doctors on duty, like Glen Innes has no intensive care ward. 30 years ago we had an intensive care ward. But some well-meaning arsehole from the Australian Medical Association or the Nurses Association or, the Royal Australian Nursing Federation, they convince the governments that you're not allowed to have an intensive care ward unless there's a doctor on duty at the hospital 24 hours a day. So having half a dozen GPs in the town who are able to answer the phone on a roster to go up to the intensive care ward in the little piddly town of 10,000 people, there's a 50-bed hospital. No, that's not good enough for the bureaucrat with 5 university degrees who lives in the city and makes up numbers on the basis of millions of people at a time and has never spent any significant amount of time out in the regions. No. So, okay, every time the Lions Club or Apex Club, Rotary Club had a fundraising drive, bought a machine, whether it be an ECG or a kidney dialysis machine, donate it to the local hospital so people haven't got to transfer to Armidale. Some bean counting bureaucratic arsehole would accept the things, thank you very much, and then move that machine 60 miles down the road to where they had 26,000 people in the town. So the hospital's big enough so that it's got a doctor on it, so that if somebody's stent breaks down, they can be taken to theatre straight away without the delay of having to put them in an ambulance. So out here in the regionals, the district hospitals, we don't get such features. So there's 10,000 people in the town of Glen Innes and the surrounding shire. If we're talking 20% of them, right, 2,000 people get sick enough to need an intensive care bed, the death rate's going to be a lot higher than 2% because we don't have the intensive care beds. All these death rates are based on the very start of the epidemic when you've got an up, running, functioning health service and only a few patients to take the numbers on. According to the numbers, which I checked out while I was sober, we're going to need like 500 intensive care beds just for the town of Glen Innes. And the beds don't exist, the nurses don't exist. So let's just say we're going to have a death rate somewhere closer to, well, India was reporting 15 deaths for 98 cases. That might be something more reasonable to be expecting. But to get back to the idea that it's out of control in Korea and it's out of control in Iran and Singapore hasn't got a handle on it either. I recall a few years ago I wrote to a bloke called Josh Frydenberg, who's these days he's Australia's treasurer. When I wrote to him, he was Australia's Minister for Energy. And I pointed out to him that Australia had about 3 weeks worth of fuel. And I pointed out that we're supposed to have 90 days worth, 3 months worth of fuel. And I pointed out that the Australian police, the Australian ambulance, the Australian fire brigade, the Australian emergency services, the Australian Army, Navy and Air Force, they don't have any fuel reserves. I pointed out that it's very difficult to imagine how the police are going to govern Australia if they haven't got any fuel to put in their vehicles. And I sent that letter via Barnaby Joyce, my local MP, and it went to Frydenberg, and it took a few months, and it came back, and he said, there, never mind. There are 47 boats, maritime petroleum tankers, permanently afloat en route from the Gulf, Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, shit oh dear, and the Singapore oil refineries, and some coming from Venezuela as well. And these boats, they're permanently on the way to Australia. And he said he was going to look into doing something else to shore it up. He didn't say that he was going to make any regulation or legislation for the oil companies to hold any strategic petroleum reserve, but he said he was going to fix it. Bugger, I might have to do a little bit of ethanol transfer. Yes, that looks more better. So it did in fact duly transpire that, maybe 6 months ago, Josh K.Y.A.G.S of the Frydenberg variety, he announced with a moderate amount of fanfare and the expectation that everybody would think what a clever little Vegemite he is, he announced that Australia's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is required by the OECD to be 90 days, which we've never complied with, and they were getting a bit shitty with us, and he was told, either you comply or we're going to kick you out of the OECD and you'll become a true fucking banana republic. He went and basically sucked up the Trump administration. And whereas the OECD says you've got to have 90 days of refined transport fuel on your country, inside your national boundaries, ready to go in order to deal with any kind of supply level shocks, Uncle Spam, the excited status of Norte armed Americano, ever since the oil crisis of 1973, when Saudi Arabia decided that they'd put an embargo on America, and they basically defeated America. And since then, America has provided for the military security of all OPEC's oil fields, and OPEC pays for that military security in petrodollars by not selling oil for anything but American dollars. So they can acquire the petrodollars to pay America for applying the military security. And if there's a shortfall in petrodollars, OPEC pays America in crude oil. The crude oil goes to Texas, and at Texas, they have an old disused salt mine, and they basically stick the oil into the salt mine. And the excited status of Norte armed Americano maintains a strategic petroleum reserve on the order of 12 months, an entire year worth of crude oil sitting in a salt mine underneath Texas. It's such a huge amount of oil that Washington is able to manipulate the world price of oil simply by threatening to sell, say, 3 months of the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to depress prices, in order to starve OPEC of funds, in order to get OPEC to be a little bit less draconian in saying, well, now you have to go to Afghanistan and have a war in Afghanistan because a rebellious princeling has run away and is accepting Taliban hospitality. Stuff like that. Okay, so Josh Frydenberg, he went and he kissed the Trumpletonian arsehole. And Prissy Dunce Tronald Dump was pleased to announce that Australia's entire strategic petroleum reserve exists in the upper left-hand northern corner of the disused salt mine where America stores its strategic petroleum reserve. And if ever Australia was threatened with any kind of a supply side shock, the excited status of Norte armed Americano undertakes to make it up, to provide Australia with the oil that would otherwise come from the Persian Gulf, where and at Iran has beachfront footage along half of the bloody thing, or Singapore, which is really close to Korea, where the Corvid-19 disease, virus, epidemic, pandemic, has laid low a whole lot of factory workers. So nobody has been putting anything on the media, the mainstream media, concerning petroleum, oil, and lubricant, motion lotion. My question is this: how many maritime tankers owned by foreign corporations like Shell, they have a lot of tankers, they're Dutch. How many overseas owned tankers have departed the Gulf of Oman and the Singapore refinery and Venezuela, headed for Australia, carrying refined transport fuel in the last 3 weeks? Because the boat that tied up to the wharves yesterday, it left a month ago. And a month ago, China shut down its factories because they were getting worried. My understanding is that governments all over the world are trying to minimize the chances of coronavirus coming into their country, or if they think it's already in their country, they're trying to minimize the spread, not because they think they're going to stop it from roaring through their country, but basically in order to slow the onset so that their intensive care wards are going to have a slightly better chance of being able to deal with the number of patients. If it kills 200 or 300 people out of every town of 10,000, and if it seems to be specialising in people over the age of 50, like me and my parents and the old buggers, well, If I was the Gale hypothesis, coming up with a way to very gently put the squeeze on the international global vile age, the age of profligate burning of fossil fuels, a very gentle virus like this one is pretty much ideal. It's not like any of the horror movies. You don't have people being infected with a rage virus causing them to run around and bash their next door neighbour's head in or try to eat them. You don't have atom bombs taking out cities all over the world and given a huge conflagration. What you have is something that causes everybody to stop going to work. What you have is a shortage of raw materials that causes all the factories to close down unless they've got the raw materials, but they've got nowhere to put their finished products. For the past month, you've been able to get free lobster in Tasmania. All you got to do is walk up to a seafood exporting company and say, I'll take a crate of lobster. And they'll give it to you for nothing because they caught the things planning on shipping them to China for the Chinese New Year, and China shut down for the Chinese New Year. And it's costing them money to buy the electricity to run the refrigerator to keep the bloody crabs and the lobsters and the prawns chilled. So you're doing them a commercial favour if they give it to you for free. Airlines are shutting down all over the world. Once the airline shuts down, they can't make their leasing contract, so the person who owns the aeroplane is going to repossess it. If in 3 months' time the coronavirus has disappeared, how's the airline going to prove to the financier that there's enough demand to justify lending them the money to lease either the same or a new aeroplane? You lose your air service, you fucking lose your air service. Here in Glen Innes, we used to have an air service. It started in about 1947 or 48. Aeroplane would take off from Sydney, fly to Glen Innes, fly to Inverell, fly back to Sydney. Neither Glen Innes nor Inverell could generate enough passengers to fill an airline, or fill even a little, 8, 10, 12 seater back in the early days. We couldn't generate enough passengers to fill half the seats on the airline in either Glen Innes or Inverell, so therefore it wasn't viable. Glen Innes plus Inverell, that gave you 75% seats filled. Christmas and Easter, aeroplane overbooked. Sometimes they put on special night flights. Avro Ansons turned into DC-3s in the 1950s. I flew into town in a DC-3 from Sydney, my first flight, and I remember it. I was 6 weeks old. The DC-3 in about 1965 turned into a Fokker F-27 Friendship. I've flown backwards and forwards in Fokker Friendships multiple times. There was a businessman in Glen Innes who had a student pilot's license. It meant that he could get on the Banks commuter run that used to fly from Sydney around to the regional areas and bring yesterday's computer tapes back to Sydney. He could get on that at 8 o'clock in the morning. He could fly to Sydney. He could catch a taxi to York Toyota. He could get a new Toyota car and he could drive it to Glen Innes and still be back in Glen Innes at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So he could boast in the New England club that he'd flown to Sydney and he'd done a day's business and he was back in town, drinking and boasting. So all the other busyness men in the Chamber of Commerce who drink at the New England club, it was as if somebody had put their toes in ice water. Their dick just shrank and shriveled up and nearly, disappeared and dropped out their bum. So they pressured the airlines to put on a twice-day flight from Sydney to Glen Innes and back to Sydney. So they could get on the aeroplane at Glen Innes at 8:30 in the morning, fly to Sydney, do a day's busyness, and then fly back to Glen Innes and be back in the New England club to say to Ian Halliday, the Toyota dealer, I was in Sydney too. And 3 airlines went broke trying to do that for them. And that's why Glen Innes has no airline service. These days, if a businessman in Glen Innes wants to go to Sydney, or if anybody else wants to fly to Sydney, first you drive to Armidale. You get on the Here We Go plane at Armidale and they fly you to Sydney. You lose your airline, the airline stays lost. Here in Australia, we had a drought for 2 years. Lots of people had no money. Lots of tourist industries were having a hard time. Then we had bushfires for 6 months. Lots of places got burnt. Made the news all over the world. Places that were not burnt had their tourism industry crash because overseas visitors had seen that Australia was on fire. Now there's a coronavirus where countries all over the world are applying travel restrictions on each other. I think Qantas and Virgin shut down half their flights. Sky 365 went broke. That's a sort of a travel agent. I can't see any way that business as usual is going to be able to continue. I foresee straightened times. The fact that if Singapore's refineries and the Persian Gulf refineries shut down, then Australia's not going to have enough refined transport fuel to even think about running the economy. Means that pretty much everything the federal government has been saying for the last week concerning control orders, and if somebody comes from here, we think we can go into your house. Yeah, that's all great. But it only works if you've got petrol to put in the police cars. And the police have no petrol. The police buy their petrol from the commercial service stations with a government credit card. The government credit card at the service station, that only works, it only works when you've got electricity from the grid going into the service station. Sorry, camera shy king parrot. It only works if you've got electricity going into the service station. Because with no 240 volt 50 cycle per second electricity feeding into the service station, which comes from the grid, which is stabilised by coal-fired power stations, the coal-fired power stations are fed by diesel bulldozers, and the diesel bulldozers are being fed by diesel coal trains. So if you haven't got refined transport fuel coming in from overseas, the grid shuts down. And when the grid shuts down, then the cash register in the service station can't tell the pump in the Bowser to fill the policeman's car. So allowing 3 weeks to get from the Persian Gulf or Singapore to Australia to unload your fuel and then move it out in B doubles around the highway network, I would say that 3 weeks after the last boatload of refined transport fuel arrives in Australia, Australia will cease to be a governable nation. Because if you think that the state police or the federal police or the army, the navy or the air force are capable of running around on foot because they don't have bicycles, just like I don't have bicycles. Last year, I spent $7,500 on fire hoses and pumps and sprinklers because what I was worried about was being consumed in a bushfire. I burned through all my spare cash and then some. I did not acquire extra solar panels. I did not acquire an e-bike because, as clever as I like to think myself for having moved out to the very hairy, perhaps lunatic fringe of society, I'm still dependent on my fossil-fueled fire chariot. I buy my booze. I buy my food. I don't brew it, distill it, or grow it. So I'm not that far advanced. I'm not that much in front of your normal suburban sheeples. But I have got a ringside seat, and I have seen it coming. And who knows? We'll see where it all goes. And I hope to be still sitting up here on the ridge in the forest on the endangered species sanctuary, being the fool on the hill. And in a year's time, maybe I will. I may not be, though. Like a lot of other people, I'm beyond the first flowering of youth. And this coronavirus, it seems pretty good at hitting old buggers. So I may finish up catching it and pushing up daisies. I may get a mild case and get over it. And if that happens, or even if it doesn't happen, because I've got nursing training, I may find myself being conscripted and pressed into service to go and try and deal with the cases of the 500 people in town who are going to need intensive care if they're going to have a 50% chance of surviving. So there you go, VB Ed, sitting in Perth. The one of my subscribers who actually, in so many words, asked me, when are you going to make a video about the coronavirus? Be careful what you wish for, because I've given it to you, Ed. I don't know how many people it's going to kill, but I have a pretty shrewd guess that coronavirus has killed the international trading economy of the global vile age. And it's doing it in a really slow, gentle fashion compared to some of the nightmares that preppers like me have been worried about for the past 40 or 50 years. So, take it as it comes. Don't fight with anybody in the supermarkets over the last can of baked beans, or the last bottle of hand sanitizer, or the last packet of toilet paper. The thing to really worry about is what happens when there's no fuel to put in the police cars, because that's when the stupid assholes who live tightly packed are going to get, well, they may choose to get, they don't have to, they can choose and decide to be calm and friendly and selfless and civilized, and they can spend all of their efforts on helping each other. But some of them are going to be selfish and stupid. If you really want to know my greatest fear regards the coronavirus, it's this. My daughter was booked to go and visit Europe in August. And 10 days before she got on the aeroplane, she broke a leg. And she had travel insurance, and they paid her $1,000 a week to get better. And she got better, and she's gone back to work, and she's worked lots and lots and lots, and 12-hour shifts and all the rest of it. And she's already paid $10,000, and she's booked to fly out of Australia in about 6 weeks' time. And she's going to Europe. And she's booked to visit 12 countries in Europe. And 5 days ago, 5 of those countries already had outbreaks. Italy and Greece. So my gravest fear, speaking as a hillbilly, speaking as a father of an almost 30-year-old who wants to go jet-setting and touristing, is that she will be stubborn enough that if our government hasn't shut down airlines, or if the airlines haven't already gone broke, then in about 6 weeks, my daughter is going to get on a bloody Herigo plane and fly outside Australia's boundaries to somewhere where she can't walk back from. And she'll find herself marooned on the other side of the world, whether she's got a bloody influenza that gives a viral pneumonia or not. And she may not have an average resistance to such a thing. It wouldn't be the first time she's had viral pneumonia. So she faces the prospect of being sick, fed up, fucked up, far from home in a foreign land where she doesn't speak the language, having persisted with a holiday that gets her marooned. If she's really lucky, she'll get as far as Great Britain because she speaks English, or perhaps she'll be stuck in Germany because she's got some relatives there. Got some relatives in Hungary too. But yeah, that's my greatest fear, is that my daughter is going to decide to persist with going on a foreign holiday at a time when the international global vile age is patently, obviously disappearing up its own fundamental orifice. And yeah, for a 59-year-old Warbles on a lot, that is a worry. A significant worry. And of course, when I was young and I had young kids, I was a tobacco smoker. So my children role modelled on me then. My son and his fiancée, they both smoke tobacco. I don't know whether coronavirus hits tobacco smokers harder than it hits non-smokers, but that's another thing for an old man to worry about. I think the bottom line is you're either going to get coronavirus or you're not, so call that a 50%. And if you get it, you're going to die or you're not. So that's another 50%. 50% of 50% is 25%. So you might say that you're looking at 1 in 4 chances of pushing up daisies by Christmas. Such is life. VB Ed asked for a warble about the coronavirus. VB Ed got what he asked for. Be careful. Smooth. Very smooth. Be careful what you ask for. In brackets, pray for, close brackets, because you're almost certain to get it. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.